heard about a young couple that bought a house and wanted to spruce it up a bit. They hired a painter to patch some cracks in the wall and repaint. But less than a month after the paint job, the cracks reappeared. When they hired a new painter to redo the work, he said, "Your real problem isn't the cracks in the wall. If I patch and repaint them, they'll just come back again. The problem is with the foundation of your house. That's what's causing the cracks." Often we approach problems in life by just patching the cracks. We want the easy fix. Just patch and paint over them. But in the Bible, God takes a much different approach. He wants us to get our lives on the proper foundation, and that foundation is none other than God Himself. Today, we're learning about how to do this. Welcome to Lesson 2 of our video small group series, God the Son. Today's lesson is called The World Behind John's World. In Lesson 1, we learned about the radical claim that Jesus is truly God. In this lesson, we're learning about the backstory to that claim, the view of the Jewish people given to them by God Himself, that there is really only one true God, and that He must be the foundation of our lives. Your relationship with God is key to everything else in your life God has designed for you. Today, in our teaching, we're taking a close-up look at a text in the Bible that sums this mega theme up in two memorable sentences. It's found in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5, and it reads like this: "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. From ancient times down to today, religious Jews have recited this passage at least twice a day. They understand it as the core of their faith, and rightly so. In the New Testament, Jesus identified this text as the greatest of all the commandments in the Old Testament. Learning about it is critical for understanding the world behind John's world. For the Christ follower, the one true God must be the only God in our lives, and loving Him in a deep and personal way is your number one priority in life. It's the foundation for everything. But before we start digging into our lesson, please turn off the video and take about 10 minutes or so to debrief your group about your homework assignment. This is not intended to be the full meal discussion. That's coming later. This is just the appetizer to get you hungry for more. Leaders, please keep the discussion moving at a quick pace. Hope you had a good debriefing time. Let's now roll up our sleeves and take a closer look at that greatest commandment text we read earlier. I invite you to open your Bible or smartphone Bible app to Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. Deuteronomy is the fifth book in the Old Testament. If you need to stop the video until everyone finds it, please go ahead. The words you are about to read are among the most important and well-known ever spoken. Deuteronomy 6:4 begins with the words, "Hear, O Israel." God is saying something of extreme importance, and He's calling everyone, in the original context, it's the nation Israel, to listen carefully. We should do the same. The Hebrew word translated hear is Shema. That's why this passage is often referred to as the Shema. From now on, whenever I speak of the Shema, think of this text in Deuteronomy chapter 6. The Shema goes on to say, "The Lord our God, the Lord is one." Notice that word Lord is printed in all uppercase letters. That's not a typo. Whenever you see Lord in all caps, that tells you that the Hebrew word underlying it is God's personal name, Yahweh. Just as you have a personal name, so does God. In my case, my name is Randy Ream. Some people call me Pastor. My kids call me Dad. My wife refers to me as her husband. They're all correct, but those aren't my names. They're titles that describe me. In the Bible, God has many titles, such as Almighty, Most High, Lord, and of course, God. But he has only one personal name, and that is Yahweh. Notice what we read in Exodus chapter 3. God also said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, the Lord," that is Yahweh, "the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name, the name you shall call me from generation to generation." That's Exodus 3:15. I know I'm repeating a bit of chapter 2, but I want to emphasize it to make sure everyone grasps this. It's crucial to understanding God's identity in the Bible. This name is used for God over 6,000 times in the Old Testament. And in the New Testament, the Greek word for Yahweh, Kurios, translated Lord, is hugely important too, as we will see later. But for now, let's get back to the Shema. It goes on to say, "The Lord our God, the Lord is one." Note the word one. Some translate this with the English word alone. The Lord alone is our God. Either way, this statement has become the cornerstone for the biblical view that there is only one true God, and his name is the Lord, or as the Hebrew puts it, Yahweh. Though other people recognize other gods, for Christ followers, there is only one God we acknowledge and worship, and that is Yahweh. The teaching that there's only one God and one alone is called Monotheism. Only one true God exists. In chapter 2 of God the Son, we explored the fact that other beings besides the Lord are mentioned continuously in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. The word translated God, the Hebrew word is Elohim, and often it refers to any spirit being, whether the true God, or other gods, or angels, or demons, or sometimes even to human spirits. In the world of the Old Testament, nearly all people, apart from the nation of Israel, were polytheists and thought in terms of many gods. The Old Testament writers accommodate this way of speaking by often referring to any sort of spirit being, whether good or bad, as Elohim. But as time goes on, Yahweh insists that he and he alone should be recognized as Elohim, because the others simply don't belong in the same league with him. He doesn't want to share this title with others. In other words, there is only one being truly deserving of the title God. The rest are so-called gods or idols. This is the biblical teaching of monotheism. But how does this square with what we read in the New Testament about the Father and the Son both being called God? This is a huge question, one that we'll explore throughout this series. For now, it's important to point out that the Hebrew word translated one in Deuteronomy 6:4 is echad. and it can, at times, refer to a compound oneness. For example, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, we're told that the two persons, the man and the woman, become one, echad, one flesh, in marriage. And so one, echad, can allow for God to be a unity of persons. Now, this doesn't mean that the Shema is teaching that God is a plurality of persons, but it does allow for it. That's important. In chapter 2 of God the Son, I discuss some of the intriguing hints in the Old Testament that though God is undeniably one, there may be more to the one God than just one person. But here, I'd like to discuss an important passage I don't explore in the book. It's found in the Old Testament book of Daniel, chapter 7. Please open up to that passage. Daniel 7 is hugely important in the Bible. Daniel sees a vision from God of 4 terrible beasts representing 4 kings of 4 kingdoms. The scene then shifts to God's very throne room, where God himself is depicted as an old man on a throne. Look carefully. Beginning in verse 9, Daniel says, "As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were open." That's Daniel 7, verses 9 and 10. This text is not only extremely important for readers of the New Testament, it was also much discussed by the ancient rabbis. Notice the usage of the word throne. The first time it occurs in verse 9, it's used in the plural, thrones. Who but Yahweh himself might have a throne in heaven's court? The text goes on to speak of the Ancient of Days, who is clearly God himself. Then Daniel mentions God's throne, a throne of fire with blazing wheels, the first ever hot wheels, I guess. The very hottest, too, no doubt. But other than this one throne, no other throne is mentioned specifically. Daniel then goes on to relate an equally stunning sight. He says, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." That's Daniel 7, verses 13 and 14. In context, this Son of Man represents God's people, just as the 4 hideous beasts in Daniel 7 represented the kings of the various empires depicted by the creatures. But notice, there's something very special about this Son of Man. As he comes into God's presence, he's given authority, glory, and sovereign power over all nations and all people, everywhere. Everyone worships him. Now we see why there's more than one throne in heaven. This text puzzled many ancient Jews because it seemed that this Son of Man had been granted prerogatives that belong only to Yahweh God. To some, this passage and several others like it suggested that Yahweh somehow exists in two forms. They pointed to passages that seemed to conceive of Yahweh as an old man, and others as a younger man. Some emphasizing God's justice, but others his mercy. Some emphasizing his transcendence over the universe, and others his close interactions with people. Some texts insist Yahweh is unseeable, and yet in other scriptures, people do see him. What gives? Remember, these were Jewish biblical scholars, not Trinitarians, poring over the Hebrew scriptures, wondering if Yahweh was one, yet also somehow more than one. Many years after Jesus, when Christians were making Jewish followers of Jesus, many of them, claiming Jesus is Yahweh, the rabbis condemned this teaching as blasphemous, calling it the two powers heresy. But maybe these heretics were onto something. The point here is that the idea of plurality within God's oneness was floating around already among some Jews even before Jesus was born. And it was generated from texts like Daniel 7 that seem to present the one Yahweh in plural terms. This is the world behind John's world. As for Jesus, his favorite title for himself was Son of Man. In fact, when he applied the Daniel 7 imagery to himself at his trial the night before he died, the high priest regarded it as blasphemy. Notice, again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death. That's Mark chapter 14, verse 61 through 64. Notice carefully, Jesus speaks of the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, a clear reference back to Daniel 7. But here, the Son of Man is seated at the right hand of God. In other words, he's taken his seat on the other throne in the throne room. Think of it. When Jesus spoke these words, he was standing before the Jewish high court, the Sanhedrin, on trial for his life. But by citing Daniel 7, Jesus is claiming that he himself will sit as judge on the highest court of all, with the power, authority, and worship that Daniel 7 says he'll receive. The Jewish court judging Jesus, he says, will see this, meaning they will stand before him one day to be judged. Jesus is saying to the Sanhedrin, one day the roles will be reversed, and I will be judging you in heaven's courtroom. I know this is a lot to absorb, and you may want to chew on it together in your discussion. But right now, I'd like to shift gears to ask how all this relates to our daily lives. What difference should it make? Let me point out one biggie. Daniel 7 says the Son of Man's authority will be over all people, everywhere, and everyone will worship him. In other words, the kind of love the Shema requires from God's people, loving him with all your heart, soul, and strength, involves directing this kind of devotion to Jesus, the Son of Man. Years ago, I remember worrying to myself, do I really love God? I know I'm supposed to, but do I really? I believe in him, read his word, and I try to do my best to follow Jesus, but do I really love God? When I was brutally honest with myself, I had to admit I didn't feel much emotional attachment to God. And I felt guilty that I didn't feel about Him the way I felt about people in my life that I cherish so much and I'm really close to, especially since I'm supposed to love God more than them with all my heart, soul, and strength. I'm trying to do all the right things, I thought. How do I love God more? Have you ever struggled with this? Having only one God means far more than simply saying you believe there's only one. The Bible says even the demons believe that. To have Yahweh as your only God means to have Him as the number one priority in your life, to put Him before everyone and everything else. It means He's the foundation of your life. Until your life is grounded fully on Him, in a relationship of love, cracks will continue to appear, and patching and painting over them isn't going to work. But it's so easy to deceive ourselves. The high priest and the other leaders in the Sanhedrin thought they were loving God and obeying Yahweh. In fact, they quoted the Shema at least twice a day and prided themselves on obeying the scriptures to the letter. But when God Himself, in human form, stood before them, they condemned Him. That sends shivers up my spine. What really began to turn the tables for me in loving God, and this is going to sound cliche, was when I began to focus on Jesus, to really connect with His portrait in the Gospels, and to realize He's blessed me far, far, far more than I deserve. Seeing myself truly as weak and needy and undeserving has opened up joy for me I never knew possible. To look at whatever happens in my life, even the rotten stuff, and realize I don't deserve better, I deserve worse. This has liberated me to love and enjoy God. Now, I know I still have light years to go on this, but I can honestly say I love Him. I find myself spontaneously saying to Him many times a day and night, I love you, Lord. I love you so much. Maybe you're on the same journey with me. Maybe you'd like to share about it now with your group. God bless you. Have a great discussion.